Welcome to the Indie Author Showcase, the podcast by indie authors for indie authors. I am your host, Chad Robert Morgan, in the most indie set in the world, my office. We were off last week pretty much by accident, so let me explain what happened. I actually listened to two different audiobooks and was reading another one, and I hadn't got the one I was physically reading finished in time. The two that I read were not bad books, but they weren't really good books either. They were books, right? I didn't want to bring something subpar onto the podcast. Now, they weren't offensively bad, right? I mean, I've read books that basically sound like they could have been kicked out by ChatGPT or just written by a fifth grader kind of thing. And it's like, obviously those things are not going to make it to the podcast. These were a little bit more borderline. In fact, there was one book that I actually put on the podcast last year that was kind of teetering on that edge of, should I put it on? Should I not put it on? And I put it on because I was absent an episode, so I went forward, and I still second guess myself on that. The purpose of this podcast is to lift up quality indie authors. We're not here to bring anybody down. I'm not going to mention what books that I read that I did not enjoy, but it still left a hole in the schedule. I spent time listening to these books. One of them I was very optimistic about, because I had met the author and talked to him and was very impressed with him as a person, and a charming person. And I just was listening to this going, oh my God, this is, I'm like, no, I can't. I mean, it's, and again, not that they were horrible, they were just mediocre. And so that left me with no book to showcase on the episode, so we skipped an episode. I can only read so much in a week while working two jobs, so, unfortunately, so we had to skip an episode. I want to talk a little bit, and I mean just a little bit, because there's another topic I want to get to, about one of the reasons why I thought one of these books was not all that great. And this has something to do with what I call chaffa. Now, I didn't come up with the term. That I'm stealing from a story that Kevin Smith told about working with Bruce Willis. He was on the set of Cop Out. He was directing Bruce Willis. Bruce Willis takes the script and starts ripping out pages. He goes, chaffa, chaffa, chaffa. And Kevin Smith is like, hey, boss, what's chaffa? And it's like, it's nonsense. It's stuff that doesn't add to the story. It's just wasted time. It's chaffa. In my earlier works, when I was first learning how to write, when I was like in high school, I did the same thing. It just, you fill it full of these really, what you think are very interesting anecdotes, but don't progress the story forward. Everything in the book has to serve the book, has to serve the story you're telling. If it's not building up your character, or if it's not building up the world, or if it's not building up the plot, it doesn't need to be there. It's just wasted space. I was watching last night The Dunwich Horror. It's a 1970s movie, and I was very skeptical because storytelling has evolved a lot since the 70s. So I'm like, it's got 5 stars. I'll check it out. It's got Dean Stockwell when he was like 12 or something like that. I mean, he was really young in that movie. And I couldn't finish it. I was bored out of my mind. And it's like, what goes on the screen has to be interesting. What goes on the page has to be interesting. It doesn't have to all add to the plot per se, but it's got to at least be interesting. And if it's just a bunch of like high school kids hanging around the lunch cafeteria before, you know, 2 chapters later when the killer shows up at night. Cut it. It doesn't belong there. And yeah, I get it. It's what would happen in real life. But this isn't real life. This is a book. And I know that kind of goes contrary to what I was saying earlier about suspension of disbelief. You have to keep a certain amount of reality going. If you're breaking that suspension of disbelief, you're going to lose the reader. Okay, granted, that's fair. It's all a balancing act. But you're also going to bore the reader if you're going on and on about how he's taking a math test when you know that the monster is coming out at midnight. Do we need to read that part? If it doesn't feed the story, either by developing characters, developing plot, or developing setting, cut it, streamline it. And this book just seemed to have a lot of chaffa in it in the beginning, to the point where when something actually interesting happened, I was half asleep and I almost missed it. In fact, I think I missed some key elements because it was just so much, oh, we're going to put on the music, we're going to dance, we're going to do this, and then, oh, someone was murdered. Wait a minute, back up a minute. When did that happen, right? Because I was so bored by that point in time. And again, if it was a slice of life story, I mean, it was well written, but it was boring, right? I had a similar argument with my editor when it was chapter 1 of Fear, because there was this incident at the end of the chapter that my editor just wanted to cut. He says, you don't need it. You know, it's more scary if you keep the monster hidden and everything like that. And he recommended cutting the entire, like, last 2-3 pages of the chapter. And my editor had a point, but I still disagreed with him because the chapter needed something interesting to happen. Otherwise, I was just doing exposition, right? Something has got to happen. Look at the way I write is sort of like writing TV episodes, right? The chapter's got to end with something that's going to hook you to make you want to read the next chapter, okay? And it doesn't have to be a violent death. It doesn't have to be, a huge car chase, but it's got to be something. There's got to be something in that chapter by the end that makes you go, I wonder what's going to happen next. If you don't have that, you got to rewrite your chapter, in my opinion. And again, this goes back to when I was first writing. I was like a freshman in high school. I wrote this big long story. I had my grandmother reading it, rest in peace. And she came back to me and says, "Yeah, I got good eventually." And she says, "Look, the only reason I read this is because you're my grandson. If you don't hook me in the first couple chapters, I'm going to put the book down. I only stuck with it because it's you. If this was somebody else, I wouldn't have gotten past chapter 3. It was boring. It got good eventually." And so that was a harsh lesson that I learned back in those days. And in one of these books that I read for last week's podcast, it just had a lot of chaffa. It just had a lot of seemingly nothing. Now, I want to balance that and kind of contradict myself and talk a little bit about this week's topic, which is fear, because this is going to launch on Halloween, aka my birthday. Thank you very much. I just watched a video from Brandon McNulty talking about fear, and he makes a lot of very good points in that video. If you haven't watched this stuff, check it out. He does a really good job of breaking down certain topics. And he covers some really good points about generating fear in your story. One of the key points that I have seen, not only in creating fear, but just in general, is not having characters that you care about. For a good example of this, look at Michael Bay's Transformers. There was a shot, you almost blink and you miss it, especially since how badly framed it was. Megatron has Jazz. He's jumped up on a building. It's this big wide shot, right? So you see both robots standing, and he just kills Jazz. Jazz had about maybe 3 lines up into this part of the movie. Jazz was one of my favorite characters in the cartoon, primarily because he was voiced by Scatman Carruthers, if you know him from The Shining. In the movie, he had like 2 lines and he was killed off. You almost didn't know that Jazz was killed, and nobody seemed to care. Nobody in the audience cared. Nobody in the movie cared. And if nobody in the movie cared, nobody in the audience is going to. Okay, Jazz was never developed as a sympathetic character. He was never developed. I'm talking specifically the Michael Bay movie. He was not given any kind of personality. He was not given any room to grow. Compare and contrast that to the premiere episode of It, Welcome to Derry. Now, I'm going to try to say this as spoiler-free as possible, but if you haven't seen it, just to be safe, you might want to skip this. But in my attempt to say this spoiler-free, we are introduced to this cast of characters. And we actually spend time with a couple of them, right? There's one character that, like, his father tells him something scary, and then it shows up as that thing scary and everything like that. So we spend time with these characters. We get to know these characters. And then we get to the end of the episode, and it's sort of like a red wedding. And not only does it really shock us, because we kind of fell into this trap of, oh, this must be our cast of characters for the show. And it was just our cast of characters for the episode, in some cases. But they actually developed these characters so we could care for them. You know, they weren't disposable red shirts. And that, that was something that didn't happen to Jazz, right? I kind of did that in my own work in Fear, where I knew I had to have a body count, and I couldn't just throw in disposable red shirts. So I had to create fleshed out characters that the audience would care about when they were killed. Because again, you watch Star Trek, nobody's going to shriek in terror when a red shirt is killed. And you know Kirk has got plot armor. So you need something else. And you need to develop them as real characters. Without creating Chaffa. So, Brandon McNulty did this real good thing about fear, generating fear in your book. I'm not going to recap everything that he said. But there was something he missed. Or I should say, he was dealing with fear in kind of a generic term. I want to talk about, and I've probably mentioned this in the podcast before, what I consider the 3 tenets of horror. Now, I learned this when I was doing research when doing my first horror book. And I found this really great episode. They break down the 3 tenets of horror. So they took a whole coursework and broke it down to one video. I'm going to take that video, break it down to a little TikTok segment. So this is a watering down of a watering down. But to put it as succinctly as possible, you have 3 tenets of horror. You have the self, the uncanny, and the other. And when you're working on horror, you want to incorporate as many of those elements into your characters as possible. The self tends to be the person's own personal fears, the person's own personal baggage. If you look at, say, Silent Hill 2, which was just recently remade, James has guilt over what happened to his wife. He's actually has it repressed, what he did. So, depending on what ending you get and what interpretation, some say it was a mercy killing, some say he was a selfish bastard who just didn't want to put up with a sick wife anymore. It is, again, it the ending changes a little bit depending on how you play the game. So both interpretations, I think, are correct depending on your choices. But the point is that we're dealing with his personal trauma. When you read Doctor Sleep, Danny is dealing with alcoholism. When you're reading The Shining, one of the really nice things about that is Jack Torrance is being tempted by his own, not only the demons of the Overlook, but his own personal demons, because he too is battling alcoholism. In the case of The Shining, he loses. But that's what makes Jack Torrance so interesting of a villain in the movie and the book, is because they are pulling him with his own flaws. They are manipulating him with his own fears. So that's the self. Let's move on to the uncanny. The uncanny is when things aren't quite right. We often see this in the sense of the uncanny valley. If we're watching a CGI movie or something like that, where the CGI looks human but isn't quite human enough to trick us. The human brain is designed or has evolved to recognize faces above anything else. And when you put a face on the screen that isn't quite right, it triggers a warning in our head that that's not right. And it freaks us out. There's a lot of examples of like, if you look at Smile with a big, and the CGI like a really big, that freaks you out because it's going into the uncanny. When you zombies are really good at the uncanny because they're human, but they don't walk right and they jitter, kind of, and it creeps you out, right? And you see this in real life as well. If you're walking down the street and you got like a homeless person walking by and they're like, you kind of arc away because, something's not right. You don't know if he's violent or not, but you know something ain't right, and you just want to make sure that you're a safe distance, right? That's happened to me before. So that's the uncanny in a nutshell. Then you have the other. The other is probably the easiest to understand, and that's just something that is blatantly different. The xenomorph from Alien, other. And anything that is just, the shark from Jaws, other, right? Anything that is completely and totally different than our normal lives. And when you are, reading a story and there's some god-awful monster that is coming up from and it's, that's usually another kind of thing. So those are your three tenets of good horror: the self, the uncanny, and the other. And I try to incorporate as many of those elements into my books as I can to really create a gut-wrenching horror that sticks with you. So again, I'm bullet pointing it. I would recommend checking out the original article. Brandon McNulty has also done a really good breakdown of generating fear in your story. I would recommend checking that one out. Both great, even if you're not doing horror, right? Brandon McNulty makes a good case of putting fear in your book to create conflict and create stakes and that kind of thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be a horror story in order to have a certain element of fear in the book. So both great topics to cover. So that's my little Halloween treat. Speaking of Halloween treat, we are going to have. This is airing on Halloween. I am publishing the first short story for Short Bites Volume 2, just in time for Halloween. It will still be a work in progress, so the final draft might be different than the one that actually gets published, but as just sort of a treat to my viewers and to all my subscribers, I am releasing the first short story. It is based on the accident I had after Monsterpalooza. It kind of inspired me, and I wanted to write it down as quickly as possible to keep as many of the details fresh. There we go, umming again. So feel free to check it out. I will put the links in the description, and I hope you enjoy it. My Halloween treat to you. With that said, let's get into this week's. As often as I'm getting them out, it's going to be a month. This week's Indie Author Showcase, and that is Extermination by Matthew Johnson. So, this one took me a little bit because I actually had to physically read it, and as I said, I have very little time. I met Matthew here over at the Halfway to Halloween Festival. He was actually my next door neighbor. Really nice guy. The book also takes place here in like Riverside County, which is not far from where I live, so it kind of had a little bit of that familiarity with it as I was reading it. Other than a few grammatical and typos in the book, I thought it was excellent. I was definitely hooked. The plot of the book is we are in a gated community, and within the gated community, nature has started rebelling. Raccoons have grown to the size of dogs. Bees are trying to honeycomb in an entire house. Everything, the shrub brushes are attacking children. Everything goes crazy. There is an overall reason behind it, and it becomes clear towards the end. One of the things that I appreciated about this book, and this is something that we tend to shy away from in horror, is we don't like killing kids, right? Because it's very visceral, right? As adults, a dead child is just the epitome of wrong, right? As adults, we would sacrifice ourselves to make sure our kids survived. We would do anything to protect our kids. To see our children injured or killed is the ultimate failure in defending our kids. So that's usually a gut punch that very few people are willing to pull. This guy doesn't pull it at all. I mean, he hits you with it full blast. And if you think about it, realistically, children would be the most likely to perish in an incident like this when the whole world is going crazy, or at least a corner of it. Children are the least likely to defend themselves. They're the least likely to make rational decisions. They're physically weak. I mean, in some cases, they can't even take care of themselves. Like, if you've got like a 2-year-old, they can't even run away. So they are the most vulnerable, and to have them all magically make it to the end of the book is kind of unrealistic sometimes. So kudos for not pulling punches when it came to that. I will say that in the beginning of the book, there did seem to be a little bit of a playful tone that very quickly evaporated. That sort of got me really into the book when I first started it. But as the story goes on, it becomes more of a straighter, and it's not really a criticism, just an observation. Because I really enjoyed that kind of this is a horror thing and I'm having fun with it kind of vibe in the beginning versus this is a horror story and carnage is about to ensue kind of thing when I got to the about maybe a third of the way into the book. So I don't know. My suggestion would be either keep that vibe throughout the book or drop it in the beginning, because it was sort of a little tonal shift. Minor critique, really. I thought the book was excellent. The characters were well developed. Most of them, there was like one red. There's a few red shirts, but he really kind of glosses over them. Like, he'll have a chapter where he just like, by the way, other shit's happening too, and he goes on and he kills about 3 or 4 red shirts within the chapter. Again, not a lot of chaffa, right? He's not wasting time with this book. He's like, here's your main characters, and just to make the world feel lived in, here, let me take a chapter and explain that 3 or 4 other people have also died. Okay, they're not the only 3 people in this housing complex. Now that I got that covered, let's go back to the story, right? And again, every time he deviates from that, it's interesting, right? The deaths are interesting. What the people are doing are interesting. Sometimes they're dying because of their own flaws, which is kind of a point in the book, is that this is nature upset at humanity's flaws, and it's wreaking revenge. So yeah, overall, great book. Highly recommend it, especially for the Halloween season. So I gotta get going. I have things to do, people to talk to. I hope you enjoyed this Halloween edition of the Indie Author Showcase. I hope you get a chance to check out the short story from Short Bites Volume 2 that will be up at the time of this podcast. And until then, keep on reading.